know that the Lord is good. One of the verses we have kids memorize at early ages is Psalm 100. And it ends by saying that. So if it's okay, if you have a Bible, let's turn to that together. If we could put it up, we're going to put up Psalm 100. Here it says, "Make a joyful noise to the Lord, all the earth. Serve the Lord with gladness and come into his presence with singing. Know that the Lord is God." And I'm going to say that again. If it doesn't come natural, know that the Lord, he is God. It is he who made us. We are his people and the sheep of his pasture. Enter his gates with thanksgiving and his courts with praise. Give thanks to him. Bless his name. Here it goes. For the Lord is good. His steadfast love endures forever, and his faithfulness to all generations. The Lord is good. Sometimes it seems like we forget it, but he is. He is good and his love lasts forever. We forget it, we stray. But it's almost as if something fortunate happens when everything around us comes crumbling down. Because when we chase after everything around us, all these things that aren't really meant to last, God is somehow gracious enough to let those things fall apart, because when everything else around us falls apart, you know what's left standing? He is. When all the things we may look to put our love and our hope into, if it's not him, everything else is going to turn to dust. But you know what's going to remain is him, the fact that he is good, the fact that he loves us. And that's what happened to the prodigal son. Obviously, if you know the story, you know it, but we see it here. His world falls apart. He puts his hope and chases after what he thinks he wants, and he just loses it all. He spends all his money, and there's a famine, so the best thing he could do is basically hire himself out to be some kind of day laborer or field worker. And so he's in this pigsty feeding pigs, and he's so hungry that he's thinking about eating whatever the pigs are eating. I don't know about you, if you've ever seen what pigs eat, it's not appetizing. I mean, even if you think that they're just eating like barn feed, that's not appetizing, but you know, in the Philippines, like, our families have pigsties, and they're just eating garbage, like literal scraps of the food that we made earlier. They're putting it in a bucket, waiting for it to start to break down, then they put it in pig troughs. You got to be at rock bottom to look at that and be like, oh man, this looks good. Talk about your low points, right? You got to be at rock bottom to see decomposing scraps that's meant for a fairly dirty animal and look at it like it's this Michelin star meal. I don't know. But that's what happens. So for him, it falls apart. And at first we look at the text and we think that all he misses is the stuff, right? We think that, oh man, you know what? He's like, even the servants in my father's house, they had more than enough bread. And we think it's about stuff, but we see later on that he's mourning this loss of relationship here. He says, you know what, I'm going to go to my dad and I'm going to tell him the truth that not only have I sinned against heaven, I sinned against you, and I don't deserve to be your son. He's not just mourning the fact that he lost things, because I really honestly believe that when he hit rock bottom here, when everything else fell apart, he realized what really stood true in his life. When he looked back, he realized that his dad was always there, that his dad truly loved him, and that if this is what he lost because of his futile pursuits, that this was actually the biggest loss he took, because it was the most important thing he had. We see him mourning the loss, what he thought was the loss of this relationship. He says, I'd be a servant in my father's house just so I could eat some scraps off his table. I'd be a servant in my father's house just to be in his presence. It's almost as if that, you know what, if I couldn't be with my father in intimacy, I'd rather just be anywhere around him, because I get that in my father's house, this is good. And we see this kind of echoed in other parts of Scripture. You think about the woman who touches Jesus' robe. Doesn't need to be directly in front of him, but knows that in just touching his robe, she was going to be healed. So he goes home, but he's unsure if he can still call it home. I have an interesting relationship with my parents as well. One, because I'm big and they're small. And at a certain point, I wonder if this was weird for my dad, because when I was 13, I outgrew him, and he had to come up with unconventional ways to discipline me, because physical discipline wasn't going to hurt me as much anymore. All jokes aside about that, there was a point in my life where I was just the most arrogant teenager you've ever met. Hard to believe, I know, because I'm so humble these days. But there was a point where I was going to leave home. And I remember the things that were going through my head were, I've heard my parents tell me that they love me, but I just don't know that they do. I don't know that I've felt it. And so I actually filed paperwork for me to leave home and go to school in Texas. And for me to save money and get in-state tuition in Texas, I started working on certain papers for me to transfer guardians like out from under my parents' name. I almost told my parents that for me to go to school somewhere else and for it to be cheap enough for all of us, let me be somebody else's son. And I didn't think about how crazy that sounds, because me talking about it out loud, it's insane, but really this is what I was going through. And something happened. It all just fell apart. And I finally fessed up to my parents how it felt for me at home and how I was just unsatisfied with our relationship. I told them that if things didn't change, like they were going to lose a son one way or another. And we began to pray through it. And one of the things I noticed was that their love language began to bend towards mine, where I really received love through words of affirmation, where I felt like before my parents, when I came into my teenage years, were more disciplinarians, and the times where they were proud of me didn't really stick out because I don't remember hearing it. But all of a sudden, I do remember hearing it more and more. But other than that, I remember praying with them and my dad praying over me. And one of those specific prayers was that we'd begin to express our love in ways that make sense to each other. And when we were apart, one of my prayers to the Lord was that he would open my eyes and my heart to see how my parents were loving me as well. And there was one Sunday where I was on my way. It was literally the first Sunday that I was going to try to lead worship at our church. And on the way to the church, my engine pretty much broke down. Somehow a piece of a cord got stuck in my engine. It caused my engine to overheat. And my parents picked me up, arranged for somebody to bring me to church so I could lead worship for the first time, and that was an experience on its own. And at the end of the service, I realized my parents weren't there. And I got home after that, and they didn't get home until about 8 p.m. that night because they were taking care of my car the whole day. And I just remember, what a fool am I? Because all of a sudden, I began searching through my memory banks, and I realized my parents were nothing but there for me every single day of my lives. I just didn't understand the way that they loved me, but all of a sudden I realized that my parents, if I was looking for words of affirmation right now, I realized that my parents showed it to me through sacrificial giving every day of my life. And what I found was my parents would love me sacrificially, and they would love me in humility as well. And this is exactly what we see in our main text. If you would look in our main text, after it says the son, when he came to himself, he said, How many of my father's hired servants have more than enough bread, but I perish here with hunger? I will arise and go to my father, and I'll say to him, Father, I've sinned against heaven, and before you I am no longer worthy, so treat me as one of your servants. And he arose and came to his father. And here's the turning point. It says, but while he was still a long way off, his father saw him, felt compassion, and ran to him, and embraced him, and kissed him. And you need to know that this wasn't appropriate, But what we see is this dad was actually looking out into the distance, waiting for his son to come home. And once he was within an eye shot, he didn't just wait there. He picked up his garments and he ran towards him. This was something that had to be done in humility, because it's not something you do when you're above somebody else. This father loved his son in humility and in sacrifice. And if you think about it, this is exactly how our God loves us as well. In the midst of our rebellion, he chose to love us. In the midst of our sin, he sent his son down for us in humility and in sacrifice, to die and rise again, conquering sin and the grave, so that we could be with him in intimacy in eternity, so that we could come home. And if we could keep this in mind, like we said, it might take practice, but in practice we could remember that above all else, only God is God, and above all else, God is always good. Sometimes we just don't understand the way he loves us. But if we can remember that, we can grow in our ability to love him, because lastly, what we're hoping to do is we're hoping that these hearts of gratitude that we're looking to grow and cultivate will lead us to be thankful in all circumstances. Thankful in all circumstances. And you have to know that this is where we're coming to, right? You have to know that this is going to be the point of not only today's sermon, but the point of our series. Like, how do we be thankful in a way that we're not just trying to bring up things on Thanksgiving Day to share with our families, but in all honesty, I want to be thankful in all circumstances, because this is what I see in the Bible. We see people go through the hardest times in their lives and somehow in the midst of it still say, God, you are good, even in this. Glory be to your name, and thank you. Even when times are rough. Even when we feel things just aren't fair. And that's what we see with the second son. We see how he just says it's not fair. Where he's like, Father, I'm the one who never left you. I'm the one who never left you. Here, your other son says that you're better off dead, takes his inheritance, and wastes it all on prostitutes. And he comes home, and you kill the fattened calf for him, and you throw this party. I'm the one who never left your side. You never even gave me a goat so that I could hang out and feed my friends. And if we're going to be honest as Christians, that's a really tempting thing to say. If we're going to be honest, it just feels like the world outside, people who are hostile towards the existence of God, there are going to be times that they don't only seem fine, it looks like they're winning. It looks like they're winning. Because when things seem messed up, we have to remember that, like we said, he alone is God and he alone is good. And the Father here says some very specific things to his son. And I think they bear repeating. I'm going to read it here. It's in verse 31, it says, he says to him, Son, you are always with me. Not only are you always with me, remember all that I have. All that is mine is yours. But it is fitting to celebrate and be glad, because your brother was dead and he's alive. He was lost, but now he's found. And I think something important happens where sometimes when we don't understand, things do seem unfair. But like we said, if we have this practice of thanking God even when it's tough, and when we remind ourselves that no matter what, only God is God and God is nothing but good, this beautiful thing happens where as we get to know his person, we also get to know his purpose. And I'm going to say that again because I think that bears repeating. As we get to know his person, we also get to know his purpose. One of the things that Pastor JC and I have been digging in with each other, and we shared it with you guys, is we need to be able to distinguish the difference between being planted and being buried. Because when we don't pay attention, those two things look exactly the same. Those two things look and feel like we're being put under the ground. It feels like God is burying us alive. The difference is, what is the purpose of it? Because when you bury something, you lay it, you cover it, and you're laying it to rest. But God can put us in the ground so that we can also bear root and then bear fruit. But know that it's a process you can't rush. Know that when he puts you in the ground and it feels like he's just letting you die, know that it takes longer to bear roots that actually can withstand the storms that come and that may knock these plants over. You're not buried. You may be being planted. And even that is something worth thanking God for. I've shared with you guys before that my family had been going through some tough times with people who had passed away. More than a year ago, my goddaughter passed away. So she was not just my goddaughter, this is my cousin's daughter. And it was a difficult time because she was only turning 18. Her mom